Welcome to the podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction About the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. The first episode I posted after our summer hiatus was actually one that I wrote for a different podcast, Beef with Bridget Todd. It told of the feud between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip V of France that culminated in that pope's humiliation at the hands of agents of the king. The so-called Outrage of Anagni in 1302 marked the effective end to the medieval papacy's claims to supremacy over Christendom's secular rulers. And if you haven't already done so, you might want to give it a listen. In this episode, we will see the first time that a pope, Gregory VII, advanced such a claim, and although it resulted in his personal humiliation, how it laid the foundation for the Papal Monarchy. Joining me once again is my favorite co-host, my partner for life, and my inspiration for all things medieval, my wife, Ellen.
Glad to be back. In the last episode, we talked about the pontificate of Leo IX, a pope who's probably only familiar to medieval and church historians and seminarians.
Yeah, honestly, Elle, did you ever hear of him?
50 years ago, maybe. But the subject of today's episode, the pontificate of Gregory VII and the Investiture Controversy, is a staple of undergraduate medieval surveys, as I can personally attest. It's usually presented as the first church-state conflict in the Christian West.
Though, as I said last time, that's not how I look at the conflict. The Investiture Controversy wasn't really a dispute between the secular state and the church. Rather, it was a dispute over who had sovereignty over the church. Whom did God appoint as his vicars on earth? To whom did he entrust the welfare of his church? Was it to anointed kings, as the Carolingian, Ottonian, and Byzantine emperors asserted? Or was it to popes and bishops? Related to that was a second core issue, whether the clergy were subject to the kings of the realms in which they served, or were the clergy a supranational, independent order, answerable only to its own hierarchy.
Meaning the kings lacked the authority to try a cleric for a crime, even rape or murder. Clergy could only be held accountable in the church's canon law courts. Richard and Jenny Paxton discussed this in the episode about the martyrdom of Thomas Becket. I love Richard's episodes with Jenny.
And in October, Jenny and I will be doing another one, this time on the significance of the Norman conquest. But meanwhile, back to the medieval papacy.
In the last episode, we talked about how Pope Leo IX was appointed by his cousin, the German king and Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, to spearhead a movement to purify the morals and behavior of the secular clergy. That movement focused on the abuses of simony, the purchase of church offices, usually from powerful laymen, and clerical unchastity. Given Pope Leo IX's importance in launching this reform movement, I asked Richard why it came to be called the Gregorian Reform rather than the Leonine Reform, and you admitted you didn't have a clue. Do you now?
Okay, I actually do. And you know why? Because I Googled it. Yes, even historians Google questions. And if you don't know about it, I would recommend google.scholar. It's a great resource in locating scholarly articles on just about any historical topic.
So what did you learn?
Unsurprisingly, the term Gregorian Reform is not medieval. Surprisingly, at least to me, is how recent it is. Apparently, the first writer to use it was the early 20th century French historian Augustin Fliche. His 3-volume work, La Réforme Grégorienne, published between 1924 and 1937, presented Pope Gregory VII as a heroic figure and credited him with creating and almost single-handedly pushing forward the church reform movement that Fliche termed the Gregorian Reform.
Stiffing Pope Leo IX.
Yeah, stiffing Pope Leo IX. The term Gregorian Reform rapidly caught on among English language as well as French church historians as a convenient way to refer to this 11th century reform movement. And it's not completely wrong. Gregory VII's pontificate was consumed and eventually incinerated by his advocacy of church reform, in particular, his anathematization of the practice of lay investiture.
As we've seen, the practice of powerful laymen investing newly elected bishops with the symbols of their episcopal office, the crozier, the fancy shepherd's crook, and a ring representing their marriage to their new see.
You might want to define anathemization. It's not really a very common term.
Anathemization basically means condemning as loathsome.
Yeah, it's jargon, right? Okay.
Actually, it's more accurate to say it's something that will get you excommunicated.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. Okay. Although Gregory VII did play an important role in reform movement, as we are going to see, he was not the first pope to promote it. Pope Leo IX was. In fact, Leo IX's contribution to church reform was fully appreciated by his contemporaries, so much so that he was canonized in 1087, just 33 years after his death. Gregory VII, by contrast, was first recognized as a beatified martyr in 1583 and was canonized in 1606. Actually, he was only partially canonized in 1606.
The delay makes sense. The papacy was recognizing him as a champion of papal supremacy in the middle of the Protestant Reformation. But what's partial canonization?
I just made that up. It actually means that for the next 122 years after his canonization, his feast day, which is on the 25th of May, was only celebrated in his birthplace, the city of Savannah, and in Salerno. In 1728, he was again canonized, and this time his feast day was made universal. That's what I meant by it.
Well, I'm not surprised that it took so long. The reforms promoted by Leo IX were not directed against kings. Gregory VII's claim to papal supremacy over all Christians, whether laity or clergy, was. Didn't he claim that the Pope could depose a king if the king acted against the Catholic faith and church?
He did, and we're going to talk about that.
Well, it must have made him a lot more controversial than Leo IX.
And he was controversial. He was controversial even during his own lifetime. St. Hugh of Cluny told an anecdote about his first impression of Gregory VII. He met him when Gregory, then known by his birth name Hildebrand, was a papal legate. Hugh and Hildebrand were riding together in a large company. Hugh fell back and was thinking about the character of the legate, and especially about his pride and self-seeking, when Hildebrand wheeled his horse about and said, "It's a lie. I seek not my own glory, but that of the holy apostles, Saints Peter and St. Paul."
Wait a minute. Are you saying he read Hugh's mind?
I'm not saying it, but St. Hugh apparently did. And yes, the story has the overtones of a miracle tale. It's recorded in early 12th century histories written by the English monks, the Admiral of Canterbury and William of Malmesbury. I'm not saying that the story is true, but it does reflect a contemporary debate over Gregory VII's motivations, and that debate outlived him. Like I said, he was a controversial figure.
You've often told graduate students and junior faculty presenting for the first time that they should begin with a thesis statement explaining the significance of their paper. Otherwise, their audience might get lost in a recitation of names and dates. What is your thesis for this episode?
Okay, here it goes. Although the practice of lay investiture was first banned by Pope Nicholas II in 1059, what historians call the Investiture Controversy dates from 1075, when Pope Gregory VII renewed that ban, along with prohibitions on simony and marriage of priests. He did this in conjunction with a dispute with King Henry IV of Germany over rival claimants to the episcopal see of Milan. The underlying issue of the investiture controversy was lay control over the appointment of bishops and abbots. Bishops in particular possessed jurisdictional authority over extensive territories and lands, and that was symbolized by the regalia with which kings invested them. Rulers throughout the Middle Ages depended upon bishops and clergy for the administration of their realms. It was therefore practically necessary for kings to appoint bishops to ensure that they had loyal and competent administrators. Their right to do so stemmed from their claim to rule by grace of God. Early medieval kings insisted that they were God's temporal vicars, charged with God to oversee and protect his church. Pope Leo IX's war against simony had been supported by the Emperor Henry III, the epitome of a theocratic king. Under Pope Gregory VII, the focus of reform shifted to lay investiture and the appointment of bishops by kings. This was an ideological challenge to the very foundations of German royal and Roman imperial power. Gregory VII explicitly rejected the Carolingian and Byzantine conceptions of theocratic kingship and substituted in their place a new vision of the spiritual and temporal hierarchy in which the Pope, rather than the Emperor, was God's true vicar on earth. Now, this idea was first fully enunciated in 1075 by Pope Gregory VII in a document known as the Dictatus Papae, and was to achieve its fullest form in the pontificate of Pope Innocent III from 1198 to 1216. That'll be the subject of our next episode. It bears repeating, the Investiture Controversy was not a conflict between church and state. Rather, it was a contest between popes and kings concerning the authority claimed by the latter over the church and the church's clergy. You know, when I used to teach this at the Naval Academy, I would tell the students that the Investiture Controversy was a sort of Frankenstein story.
Okay. Who was Dr. Frankenstein and which one was the monster?
Okay. The monster was the Reformed papacy. Its creator was the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. And, as in Mary Shelley's novel, the monster inevitably turned upon its creator. The eventual outcome was the destruction of imperial power and authority in both Germany and Italy. Now, sometimes I would change things up a bit and identify the monster as church reform and Dr. Frankenstein as Pope Leo IX and the Reformed papacy. That also works because as papal power and wealth increased in the 12th century, the papacy itself became a target of the reformers.
Okay.
The reason for this is that laymen, especially in the growing commercial cities of northern Italy and Flanders, were among the most ardent supporters of church reform. As we discussed in the last episode, the commercial revolution led to an outburst of lay religious enthusiasm and demands from both the pious laity and the Reformed clergy for a purer, more spiritual conception of the church.
You know what that reminds me of?
No, I don't. What does it remind you of?
The outburst of religious enthusiasm in the burnt-over districts of early 19th century America.
New York, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's actually a really pretty good comparison. And it allows me to do something I love to do, which is plug a book by a friend and former military colleague who is now a civilian professor at Wesleyan College, Dr. Joe Slaughter. Joe's book is Faith in Markets, Christian Capitalism in the Early American Republic.
Okay, back to the overview. I mean, we are getting close to the end, right?
Yes, dear. As the papacy consolidated power over the Western Church, the papacy required more and more money to pay for an extensive network of canon law courts and its institutions of government. The papacy's need for and efforts to extract money from clergy and laity led to it itself becoming a target of reformers who in turn became anathematized by the papacy as, guess what? As heretics.
Okay, back to the story. We ended the last episode with Pope Nicholas II at a council in the Lateran in 1059, issuing a revolutionary papal bull that made cardinal bishops solely responsible for electing popes. Catholic priests and deacons and the other Roman clergy, along with the Roman laity, were then to acclaim that choice.
Before this, popes had been chosen either by the noble families of Rome and the Papal States or by the German king in his capacity as Holy Roman Emperor. And that's when the German king was actually in Italy. The pious King Henry III, intent upon reforming the church, which he believed that God had entrusted to his care, appointed 4 popes in a row between 1046 and his death in 1056. But in 1059, the King of Germany was a 9-year-old boy, King Henry IV, and the Reformed papacy was threatened by a resurgent Roman nobility. The papal electoral decree was directed against them rather than the boy king who was specifically mentioned, quote, saving the honor and reverence due to our beloved son Henry, who is at present called king and will be in the future, as it is hoped, emperor by God's grace, according as we now have granted to him and to his successors, who shall obtain the right personally from this apostolic see, end quote.
Now, what this honor and reverence entailed was left vague. I mean, it could just be the courtesy of a formal notification after the choice had been made. But what was clear, however, is that any role played by an emperor in papal elections was a privilege granted by a pope to an emperor, not an imperial right.
Although King Henry IV was a child, his regent mother, Agnes, and her advisors rejected the papal electoral decree as an encroachment upon imperial authority. She was supported in this by the powerful German bishops who chafed under the claim of papal supremacy and resented the disciplinary actions that the Reformed papacy had taken against other bishops.
Was the German court also concerned with the deal that Nicholas II had made with the Normans of southern Italy? You said in the last episode that the Normans of southern Italy were a low priority for the Emperor Henry III, as he saw them as a Byzantine problem.
Yeah, Henry III had seen them as a low priority, but Agnes was concerned that Pope Nicholas II had not consulted her first in dealing with the Normans.
What did the deal with the Normans entail?
Okay, as we talked about in the last episode, in 1053, Pope Leo IX had led an army against the Normans. His army was routed, and he himself was captured in the Battle of Civitate. Pope Leo spent the next 9 months in honorable captivity in Benevento. He was only released when he fell ill and was allowed to return to Rome, where he soon after died, about a month later. Where Leo IX saw the Normans as brigands and a threat, Cardinal Hildebrand,
the future Pope Gregory VII.
Yep, the future Pope Gregory VII persuaded Pope Nicholas II to make a 180-degree shift and seek an alliance with the Normans.
Why?
The papacy needed military support against the local Roman aristocracy and their anti-pope, a man whom they had appointed as Pope, Benedict X. They couldn't get it from the German court, so they looked to the south. The deal they made was a classic quid pro quo. The Normans had power. They held southern Italy and parts of Sicily by conquest.
The other Norman conquest.
Yes, the other Norman conquest. Anyway, they held southern Italy and Sicily by conquest, but lacked legitimacy. And that is what Pope Nicholas II offered them. He recognized Robert Guiscard as Duke of Apulia and Calabria and as Lord of Sicily, and he recognized another Norman mercenary chief, Richard of Aversa, as Prince of Capua.
Wait a minute, weren't those parts of a Byzantine province in southern Italy? What right did a pope have to recognize these Normans as legitimate rulers?
He had the donation of Constantine.
Okay, it was forged but irrelevant.
Yes, and it wasn't recognized as a forgery until the 15th century. Now, according to the donation of Constantine, this mid-8th century document that was concocted in the papal chancery, the Emperor Constantine had given the papacy rule over the Western Empire and all of its islands, which means also Sicily, when he departed for his new capital city of Constantinople. And that brings us to the quo part of the deal. In return for recognizing their legitimacy, Robert Guiscard and Richard of Aversa recognized the overlordship of the papacy and did homage and fealty to the papacy for their territories. The payoff was immediate. Richard of Aversa laid siege to the anti-pope stronghold of Galeria and took Benedict X captive.
Okay, so how did the German royal court respond to the papal election decree when Nicholas II died?
As you might expect. When Nicholas II died in 1061, the cardinals, at the instigation of Hildebrand, chose one of their own to be pope, and that was Pope Alexander II. They did so without bothering to consult the German court.
So much for saving the honor and reverence due to King Henry IV.
Yeah. To be fair, the honor and reverence was due to Henry only once he became emperor. But the German court did regard the election as an affront. And when they received two embassies, one from the Roman nobility and the other from a group of Lombard bishops hostile to reform, they granted their pleas and named their own pope. The man they chose was Peter Candulus, Bishop of Parma. He was an ardent traditionalist opposed to church reform. He took the papal name, or maybe I should say the anti-papal name, Honorius II.
Okay, so he's an anti-pope.
Yeah, he is an anti-pope. When Pope Alexander II died in 1073, it became Hildebrand's turn to become pope.
Finally, we get to Pope Gregory VII. I take it that he was elected following the procedures laid down in Pope Nicholas II's electoral decree.
You would think he would have been, but he wasn't.
Huh?
And it raised questions later about his legitimacy as pope.
Okay.
Hildebrand's election was actually stage managed in 1073 by Hugh Candidus, a cardinal priest who was one of Leo IX's companions from Lorraine. During the burial of Pope Alexander II, Hugh rose in the pulpit and addressed the throng of clergy and laity. Brethren, you know that from the days of Pope Leo, it is Hildebrand who has exalted the Holy Roman Church and freed this city. Wherefore, since we cannot have anyone better fitted to be elected as Roman pontiff, we elect him now, a man ordained in our church, a man known to you all and approved by all." End quote. Hildebrand was immediately elected pope by the other cardinals without prior deliberation and without discussion. Now, both of those were required by the electoral decree, but it was a heat of the moment. They just named him pope, and then he was acclaimed by the lesser clergy and laity. He took the name Gregory VII in honor of Gregory I, Gregory the Great, but it may well have been in honor of his late mentor, the disgraced Pope Gregory VI, the Simonist. The clause in Pope Nicholas II's electoral decree about the honor and reverence due King Henry IV was completely ignored.
But he was elected by the cardinals as required. I'm not sure how the election, as you described it, could have been used to challenge his legitimacy.
King Henry IV and the German bishops recognized that. When they drew up a list of charges justifying his deposition, they offered a more serious irregularity. They accused him of having obtained the papacy through simony.
Simony? I mean, who did they think he bribed? The cardinals?
They never said. I think it's a really bogus charge, and it was probably meant to remind people that the previous Pope Gregory VI, had been a Simonist and had been Hildebrand's patron.
Oh, okay. So how seriously should we take the description of Hildebrand's election being enthusiastically acclaimed by the Roman clergy and laity?
That I don't doubt. Unlike the previous 7 popes, Hildebrand was one of their own. Although born in Tuscany, Hildebrand had grown up as a monk in Rome, and his dual affinities were to the city and to the monastic profession. In Rome, his allies were the new urban families of financiers and businessmen who used their fortunes in support of the reformers. His most stalwart noble supporter was not a German, but was Countess Matilda of Tuscany. Unlike his recent predecessors, Gregory VII lived in Rome, and he only left the city twice. He went north once, the journey that was to end at Canossa, and he went south once. That journey south was in 1084 when the Emperor Henry IV captured Rome, and Gregory VII had to call upon his Norman vassals to rescue him. He ended his life in southern Italy as an exile from his beloved city and as a broken man.
Still, do you see his pontificate as a turning point in the history of the papacy?
I do. He may not have been the father of the Gregorian reform, but he was the pope most responsible for the Investiture Controversy. He was also the first pope to lay out the claims of the Papal Monarchy to moral supremacy over not only the clergy, but over all Christians. The key to Gregory VII's policies was the extension of the reform movement to include the independence of the church from secular authority.
Okay, the underlying issue of the Investiture Controversy.
Yeah, but beyond that, Gregory VII asserted the supremacy of the papacy not only over all other bishops, but over all Christians, including kings. Theocratic kingship maintained that kings were sovereign over the church as well as the state. What Gregory VII did is he turned this on its head. He maintained that popes were placed by God not only above the clergy, including all other bishops, but above Christian rulers, including emperors. His conception of the papacy is revealed most fully in a document known as the Dictatus Papae.
The dictates of the Pope?
More precisely, it's translated as that which is dictated by the Pope. Although it's uncertain whether Gregory VII or a member of the papal curia actually composed this list of 27 title headings.
Title headings?
Yeah. The document reads like the table of contents of a canon law collection. In fact, in 1087, Cardinal Deus Dadet issued a collection of canon law that follows the Dictatus Papae pretty closely. Some believe that he was responsible for drafting it. What we know for sure, however, is that the Dictatus Papae was entered into the papal register in March of 1075. Elle, why don't you do the honor of reading them? I've rearranged them thematically. It makes more sense this way. You will be able to understand better what Gregory's points were.
So, the topics are: the Roman Church was founded by God alone. The Roman pontiff alone can with right be called universal. No synod shall be called a general synod without his order. He who is not at peace with the Roman Church shall not be considered Catholic. The Roman Church has never erred, nor will it err to all eternity, Scripture being witness. Okay, I'm guessing some of that's directed against the claims of the Patriarch of Constantinople to equality with Rome?
Yeah. That's how I see it. Together they assert that the Roman Church is the one universal church with the Pope as its head. Go on to the second group of titles.
The Roman pontiff, if he has been canonically ordained, is undoubtedly made a saint by the merits of St. Peter, as it is contained in the decrees of Pope St. Symmachus. Wait, that sounds like papal infallibility.
Yeah, that plus the idea that the Roman Church has never erred together does sound like papal infallibility. And in fact, it's based upon the same general idea that the Pope is the successor to St. Peter. And because God gave to St. Peter the keys to his kingdom, that the Pope now has the keys to the kingdom.
Okay, going on. His name alone shall be spoken in the churches. This is the only name in the world. What does that mean?
It refers to liturgical services. Only the Pope's name, not the name of another bishop or of a king or a count in whose realm this is taking place, is to be said in the liturgies.
Okay. Now, in terms of the law, the more important cases of every church should be referred to the Apostolic See. A sentence passed by him may be retracted by no one. He alone may retract it. Among other things, we ought not to remain in the same house with those excommunicated by him.
That actually seems to have been directed against King Henry IV, who was still giving hospitality to German bishops who had been excommunicated by both Gregory and his predecessor. Okay, go on.
No one shall dare to condemn any person who appeals to the apostolic chair. He himself may be judged by no one. For him alone is it lawful, according to the needs of the time, to make new laws, to assemble together new congregations, to make an abbey of a canonry, and on the other hand, to divide a rich bishopric and unite the poor ones. Okay, unitary papacy doctrine, in which the popes have full and unfettered executive and legislative power.
Yeah, I know. The dictates of the Pope are sort of the Project 2025 of the late 11th century papacy.
Okay, the next ones, and I can just imagine the other bishop's reaction. He alone can depose or reinstate bishops. He may depose and reinstate bishops without assembling a synod. In council, his legate, even if a lower grade, is above all bishops and can pass sentence of deposition against them. Okay?
Yeah, bishops couldn't be very happy about that. And as we're going to see, the most ardent supporters of Emperor Henry IV in the Investiture Controversy were, in fact, the bishops of Germany and Lombardy. They may have acknowledged, at least in theory, that the Bishop of Rome was the first among equals, but there is nothing equal in Gregory VII's conception of the relationship between the Pope and the episcopate. And saving the best, or at least the most controversial, for last.
Quote, he alone may use the imperial insignia. All princes shall kiss the feet of the Pope alone. It may be permitted to him to depose emperors, and he may absolve subjects from their fealty to wicked men. Wow, just wow.
As I said, the Dictatus Papae is the first and fullest expression of the Papal Monarchy. It presents the Pope as the head of the universal church, supreme over all other bishops, including the Patriarch of Constantinople. The Pope can judge everyone, but he can be judged by no one. And by virtue of being Pope, he is imputed with saintliness. But the most revolutionary claim is the Pope's supremacy over the secular rulers of Christendom, including emperors. I haven't seen this argued in the scholarly literature, but it strikes me that the Dictatus Papae presents the Pope as the ultimate feudal overlord in Christendom. Not only are the Norman rulers of southern Italy the vassals of the papacy, all Christian rulers are. I would add that Gregory VII's exalted view of the papacy is also revealed in his preaching of a holy war to recover Palestine in 1074, a project that was to be sidetracked by the outbreak of the Investiture Controversy.
I guess that would have to wait for Pope Urban II. And how did King Henry IV and his advisors react to the assertion that the Pope could judge his fitness to rule and absolve his subjects of their fidelity?
Well, there's no evidence that the Dictatus Papae actually circulated beyond the papal curia.
Just as well.
But we do know how Henry IV reacted when Gregory VII tried to put into practice what he had written down on parchment. He tried to depose Gregory VII.
The last we heard of Henry IV was that he was a child king, with his mother Agnes as regent, trying to control a bunch of insubordinate dukes and bishops. But when Gregory VII became pope, Henry was 23. So how did they get along?
They clashed from the very beginning.
Okay.
Once Henry came of age, he focused on recovering royal lands and authority that had been distributed in his name during his minority or had been seized by German magnates. The bulk of his family lands were in Saxony, and that's where he concentrated his efforts. But he was also concerned about maintaining royal authority over the episcopate, and that is where he first came into conflict with Gregory VII. The issue had to do with the dispute over the See of Milan that actually predated Gregory VII's accession to the papal throne. Milan, the See of St. Ambrose, was after Rome the second most important bishopric in Italy. It had been experiencing social and ecclesiastical unrest since 1057, when a lay movement known as the Paterini, literally the rag pickers.
Rag pickers? Was this lower class?
Not really. It was a communal movement drawn largely from the new commercial class of merchants and bankers. The derisive term Paterini was given to them by their opponents, many of whom came from rural aristocratic families. Okay, back to the story. These late church reformers objected to what they saw as the immoral lifestyle of Milan's clergy and used violence to separate priests from their concubines.
Well, that is in line with the Reformed papacy's attack on clerical marriage and concubinage, although violence on priests might not have been the approved way of opposing it.
Yeah, one person who greatly disapproved was Milan's Archbishop Guido. Guido was a traditionalist who had no sympathy for the reform movement.
So let me guess, the Paterini turned against the Archbishop.
They did. They denounced him as a Simonist, and they demanded that he step down.
Was he, and did he?
He was. At least he was, according to the reformist definition of simony. He would have said that he had responded as he should have to the favor shown to him when he was elevated to the see by giving an appropriate gift. The merchants and bankers of Milan disagreed. They saw it as a commercial transaction. And, of course, he refused to resign his office. At this point, the papacy got involved. Pope Nicholas II sent two legates, Cardinal Peter Damian and Bishop Anselm of Lucca, to Milan. Although the Pope and his legates were committed to the reform movement, what they really were concerned about was getting the Milanese church to accept papal supremacy. Consequently, they imposed only a small penance on the offending clergy, and after Guido professed his loyalty to Rome, allowed him to remain as archbishop.
So much for reform.
Matters went off the rails when Guido died in 1072. Henry IV chose a loyal cleric to succeed Guido and got the Lombard bishops who opposed the reform movement to consecrate him as archbishop. The Paterini of Milan were outraged, and with the support of the papal legates, they chose a Milanese cleric sympathetic to reform as their archbishop. And the result was a schism in the Church of Milan. Pope Alexander II supported the reform candidate, and when he was stonewalled by the German court, responded by excommunicating 5 royal advisors, asserting that they were guilty of simony. But that had little impact in terms of what actually was happening on the ground in Milan, where there remained 2 archbishops. Now, that is the problem that Gregory VII inherited when he became pope.
So I assume he excommunicated the anti-reform archbishop?
Actually, he didn't.
Huh?
Instead, he lifted the excommunication on Henry's clerical advisors and tried to find a solution acceptable to both sides.
Wow, I never thought of Gregory VII as accommodating.
He had a lot of experience when he was a cardinal as a negotiator. He didn't want to pick a fight with the king of Germany, who he knew would soon be traveling to Rome to be consecrated emperor. But the dispute in Milan only got worse. In 1075, the Paterini rioted and they burnt down the cathedral.
Oh, dear.
Their opponents responded by killing the leader of the movement and seizing power in the city. Recognizing that their candidate was never going to win popular support, the leaders of the anti-reform party appealed to King Henry IV to end the violence by setting aside the 2 rival archbishops and investing a new one. Henry IV in 1075 was, for the first time during his reign, feeling secure in his rule. He had put down a rebellion in Saxony, and in doing so he had recovered his hereditary lands and reasserted royal authority over the German dukes and bishops. A confident Henry IV responded to the appeal by investing the Milanese cleric Tedbald as the new Archbishop of Milan, as well as appointing new bishops to the sees of Fermo and Spoleto.
And did he consult Pope Gregory about any of this?
What do you think?
Of course not. He was a theocratic king, and those bishops were his men. How did Gregory VII respond to this?
By renewing the excommunication of the 5 advisors and sending a letter to Henry IV reproaching him for disobedience and for maintaining contact with men excommunicated by the Pope.
I'm almost afraid to ask, how did Henry IV respond to this?
By summoning a diet that is an assembly of German bishops and lay magnates to Worms to condemn the Pope. The diet met on the 24th of January in 1076. At that diet, 2 archbishops and the majority of the German episcopate withdrew their obedience to Gregory VII on the grounds of his irregular election and immorality. A few weeks later, the bishops of Lombardy, meeting in a synod at Piacenza, declared their solidarity with the German episcopate and also renounced their obedience to the Pope. Gregory responded by holding a Lenten synod at the Lateran Basilica in Rome, where he excommunicated the Lombard bishops who had sided with King Henry.
I see what you mean, that this wasn't a church versus state conflict. It sounds like the Reformed papacy's most ardent supporters were laymen, and Henry IV's were bishops.
The Reform movement and the claims of the Reformed papacy had challenged the traditional independence of those bishops, most of whom had been appointed by either King Henry III or King Henry IV. Henry IV followed up with a letter he sent to Gregory VII on the 24th of January, 1076. Ellen, why don't you do the honors?
Henry, King, not through usurpation, but through the holy ordination of God. To Hildebrand, at present not pope but false monk. By wiles you have achieved money. By money, favor. By the sword, the throne of peace. Okay, that sounds like simony, but what's the sword part, and what's it based on?
It is an accusation of simony. By the sword probably refers to his support of the Paterini and their support of him.
Okay.
Ironically, the charges against Gregory VII were drawn up by Candidus, the cardinal who had stage managed his election. He had switched sides.
Well, clearly.
Yeah. Okay. back to the letter.
Okay, deep breath. And from the throne of peace you have disturbed peace, inasmuch as you have armed subjects against those in authority over them, inasmuch as you have taught that our bishops called of God are to be despised, inasmuch as you have usurped for laymen the ministry over their priests, allowing them to depose or condemn those whom they themselves had received as teachers from the hand of God, through the laying on of hands of the bishops. You have attacked me, who, unworthy as I am, have yet been appointed to rule among the anointed of God, and who, according to the teaching of the fathers, can be judged by no one save God alone. St. Peter himself said, "Fear God, honor the king."
I love that he used the words of St. Peter against Pope Gregory. Clear proof that Hildebrand was not, as he claimed, the saint's successor. Sorry for the interruption. Please go on.
But you, who fear not God, have dishonored me, whom he hath established. You, therefore, damned by this curse, and by the judgment of all our bishops, and by our own, descend and relinquish the throne of St. Peter, which you have usurped. Let another ascend the apostolic chair, who shall not practice violence under the cloth of religion. Henry, king by the grace of God, say unto thee, together with all of our bishops, descend, descend, to be damned throughout the ages. Wow. Tell us how you really think.
So, Gregory responded by declaring Henry IV and the bishops who followed him to be excommunicated and deposed. The way he did this was using a prayer to St. Peter. After all, he is a successor to Peter. O St. Peter, chief of the apostles, incline to us. I beg your holy ears, and hear me, your servant, whom you have nourished from infancy, and especially to me as your representative, and by your favor has the power been granted by God of binding and loosing in heaven and on earth. On the strength of this, for the honor and security of your church, and in the name of Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, I withdraw through your power and authority from Henry the King, son of Henry the Emperor, who has risen against your church with unheard of insolence, rule over the kingdom of the Germans and over Italy. And I absolve all Christians from the bonds of the oath which have made or shall make to him, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king. And since he has scorned to obey as a Christian, I bind him in your name with the chain of anathema.
Wait a minute. We've seen kings and emperors deposing popes. I don't remember a pope deposing a king.
This was a first. Even St. Ambrose, whom Gregory claimed as a precedent in his letter to Hermann, Bishop of Metz, had only excommunicated the Emperor Theodosius.
Let me guess. And the dukes of Germany saw this as a golden opportunity to clip the power of the king and regain the powers they had enjoyed when he was a child.
Oh, Ellen, how cynical of you. Yes, the German dukes did obey the Holy Father, and they withdrew their fidelity from the excommunicant king. But they did so with sad hearts and only out of reverence for the Pope. Okay, you're right.
You can't kid a kidder.
Yeah, they did. More surprisingly, even the bishops who had urged Henry to confront the Pope now scrambled to the side of the Pope, probably because of the support given the Pope by the dukes. Henry could do no more than extract a promise from the magnates that they would delay electing a new king for a year to give Henry a chance to obtain absolution.
I know where this is going. Canossa.
Yeah, northern Italy. Yes, to Canossa. The best example of how one can actually stoop to conquer. The German princes planned an assembly in Augsburg for February 1077, and they invited Pope Gregory to attend. Henry realized that his only hope was to be reconciled to the Pope and to rob his opponents of the legitimacy that they enjoyed, reducing them to the level of rebels.
Okay.
He did so by secretly crossing the Alps and intercepting Gregory at Canossa. And this was in January of 1077, the middle of winter. Canossa was a fortress belonging to Matilda of Tuscany, a stalwart defender of the Reformed papacy. Gregory took refuge there, believing that Henry intended to attack him. But Henry surprised Gregory by coming in the garb of a penitent. Gregory initially hesitated to grant reconciliation, but was persuaded by the pleas of Abbot Hugh of Cluny, Henry's godfather, and by Matilda. Gregory described what happened next in a letter that he sent out to all the German princes. There, on 3 successive days, standing before the castle gate, laying aside all royal insignia, barefooted and in coarse attire.
Gregory must have loved keeping Henry standing barefoot in the dead of winter for 3 days.
He did. The letter continues. He ceased not with many tears to beseech the apostolic help and comfort until all who were present or who had heard the story were so moved by pity and compassion that they pleaded his cause with prayers and tears, even crying out that we were showing not the seriousness of apostolic authority, but rather the cruelty of a savage tyrant. At last, overcome by his persistent show of penitence and the urgency of all present, we released him from the bonds of anathema and received him into the grace of the Holy Mother Church.
Okay.
And Gregory also demanded an oath from Henry to accept the papal judgment in his dispute with the rebels and to permit Gregory to travel safely to Germany. Henry had been humiliated publicly, but he had also won a political battle.
And it was a worthwhile humiliation. The Pope, as a loving father, had been forced by his pastoral obligations to accept back the prodigal son. This undercut the rebel German dukes and gave Henry some time to marshal his forces.
The German princes, in defiance of both Henry and Gregory, proceeded immediately to elect Rudolf of Rheinfelden as their new king. 2 papal legates were present, and they gave their approval, but Gregory refused to recognize Rudolf. The decision was to take place not on the papal court, but on the battlefield, where Henry's troops defeated the rebels. Rudolf died in battle in 1080 and was succeeded by a new anti-king, Hermann of Goslar, who wielded no real power outside of his patrimony in Lorraine.
And I'm sure Henry IV was so grateful to Gregory VII that he gave up the practice of lay investiture and allowed the free election of bishops, right?
We both know better.
Yeah, we do.
With the threat of deposition removed, Henry IV reasserted his position as a theocratic king. A frustrated Gregory VII finally acknowledged Rudolf as king of Germany in 1080, right on the eve of that fatal battle. He also deposed Henry for a second time for breaching his vows to the Pope. But strangely, this excommunication and deposition were without force. Henry responded with an anti-pope. He chose Guibert, Archbishop of Ravenna, whom Gregory VII had excommunicated for supporting Henry. Gregory's dithering had allowed Henry to win militarily and politically.
This seems that the high point of Gregory VII's pontificate was his deposition of Henry IV and the king's humiliation at Canossa. At this point, he seems to have briefly made the claims in the Dictatus Papae a reality, and to go to Canossa became an idiom for having a coerced submission and humiliation. But, as you said, Canossa was an example of stooping to conquer. It only worked because Henry IV realized he could use his weakness as a penitent son of the church to compel the Pope to forgive him.
Yeah, in this case, weakness became a strength. I also have no doubt that Henry IV had no intention of submitting to the papacy beyond for those 3 days. If Canossa was the high point of Gregory's pontificate, the low point came in 1084 when Henry IV entered Rome peacefully. The gates opened to him by the people of Rome. Even some of the reformers had deserted Gregory. The cardinal priest Euconditus, remember, the man who stage-managed Gregory's election, now stage-managed his deposition, drafting a condemnation that accused Gregory of poisoning his predecessors. And of subverting the ecclesiastical order, probably a reference to Gregory's deposition of a number of bishops and his appointment of their replacements. At a synod held at Brixen, the anti-Pope Clement III was formally elected Pope by 13 cardinals and with support from the other members of the papal curia. On Easter Day, Henry IV was anointed Roman emperor by his anti-pope. Despite Henry IV's occupation of Rome and the desertion of the papal curia to Clement III, Gregory VII refused to abandon Rome. He took refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, which was once Hadrian's tomb, but was now a papal fortress, and wrote to his Norman vassals asking for military aid. The
Okay.
Normans responded by attacking Rome, rescuing Gregory, and taking him to safety in the south. Gregory's rescue by the Normans showed the wisdom of his predecessors' policies. It also left bitterness in Rome because the Normans, being typically Norman, took advantage of the rescue to sack the city.
Of course they did.
Gregory spent his last days as a guest of Robert Guiscard in Salerno. He died an embittered man on the 25th of May in 1085, at the same time that his great opponent, Henry IV, was forcing all of Germany and Italy to submit to his kingship. Gregory VII's last words were an ironic and bitter play on Psalm 45. That psalm says, "I have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. This is why God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above all your rivals." Gregory concluded the psalm with, "And therefore I die in exile."
But as anyone who has taken a medieval survey course knows, Gregory VII did not entirely fail. The Reform movement continued as the Reformed cardinals gathered together and elected a successor in 1087. The final victor in the ideological battle was to be more Pope Gregory VII than King Henry IV.
Eventually, yes. But the more immediate solution to the lay investiture controversy and the underlying issue of who had the right to choose bishops ended up as a compromise.
Okay. Wasn't Gregory VII's second successor after the one who made Henry IV emperor, Urban II, the pope who called for the First Crusade?
Yeah, Urban II was one pope removed.
Yeah. So how does Pope Urban and crusading play into our story of the rise of the Papal Monarchy?
Okay. Urban II, whose birth name is Odo, was an aristocratic Frenchman. He had been Archdeacon of Reims and Prior of Cluny before he became Cardinal Bishop of Ostia under Gregory VII. In 1089, backed by the soldiers of Matilda of Tuscany, married by advice of Urban to the 17-year-old German noble Welf V, who was 26 years her junior, Urban succeeded in driving the anti-Pope Clement II from Rome. But it wasn't until 1094 that he obtained control over the Lateran itself. He won over Clement's supporters by paying them compensation.
Wait a minute.
Yep.
Wait a minute. Just the word simony comes to mind. Okay, never mind.
Meanwhile, King Henry IV's fortunes took a turn for the worse. He was militarily defeated in Tuscany in 1092, and with his son, Conrad, rebelled against him in 1093. Urban took advantage of this by recognizing Conrad as king and by arranging a marriage between him and the daughter of the Norman Count Roger of Sicily. Henry even suffered personal humiliation in 1095 at the Council of Piacenza when Urban granted Henry's second wife a marital separation on grounds of her husband's sexual depravity.
Ew, another humiliation at the hands of the papacy. So Urban II was using marriage both to arrange for politically beneficial marriages and to end those that weren't.
Yeah, and marriage is a sacrament of the church, and bishops were basically marital counselors. But Urban II wasn't always successful as a matchmaker. At the same time he was dissolving Henry IV's marriage, the young Welf V deserted his wife. He did so on the grounds that Matilda was refusing to pay her marital debt.
Wait a minute. He'd been married to Matilda for, 7 years and was claiming that marriage had never been consummated?
No, he didn't really seek an annulment. He just left her. He remained married to her, but childless at the time of his death in 1120. Some historians believe that the real reason was that he discovered that Matilda was planning on leaving her entire fortune to the papacy, which made her a much less attractive match. That might also explain why Welf V at this point switched loyalties from the papacy to Henry IV.
So how does the Council of Clermont and Pope Urban II's call for crusade play into the story of the growth of papal power?
The Council of Clermont of 1095 began as a typical Reformed synod. Urban II renewed Gregory VII's prohibitions against lay investiture, proclaimed the peace of God, prohibited, once again, simony, defined fasting practices, prohibited the laity from possessing tithes or churches, and forbade clergy to do homage to kings or other laymen. But most famously, he preached the First Crusade there. Urban's call for an armed pilgrimage to aid the Byzantines and to liberate the Holy Sepulchre from the Turks recalled Gregory VII's dreams of holy war. Both popes believed that the papacy had the right and the duty not only to limit, but to direct the military activities of the Christian laity.
Okay. Resolving the schism between the Roman Catholic and Orthodox churches might also have played a role in Urban's response to the Byzantine Emperor Alexius's request for military aid. But then the overwhelming response in Western Europe to Urban II's call must have bolstered the prestige of the papacy.
I think it surprised everyone. Even Urban could not have imagined 60,000 to 100,000 people answering his summons. What I find interesting, though, is who didn't go on the First Crusade.
Let me guess, kings.
Exactly. Dukes and counts went, to be sure, but no kings went. King William Rufus of England was generally hostile to the papacy. King Philip I of France had been excommunicated because of his adulterous union with Bertrada de Montfort.
And, of course, we know why Henry IV didn't go.
Yeah, things were going really badly for Henry IV. And like I said, in 1093, his eldest son Conrad, whom he had crowned king in 1087, deserted him and threw his support to the papacy. Henry didn't do any better with his second son, Henry. After having Conrad deposed, he had the young Henry crowned king in 1099. Their co-regency lasted for 5 years. In 1104, however, Henry V forged an alliance of German nobles to overthrow his father.
So, the next pope?
Yeah, next pope, Paschal II, took a hand in the matter by absolving Henry V of an oath of fealty he had taken to his father in 1099. Henry IV planned to attend an assembly of the German princes of Mainz convoked by his son to defend his claim to the throne. But on his way, he was taken prisoner and forced to abdicate. He didn't give up and was continuing to contest his son for the throne when he died in 1106.
Okay, we seem to have lost our focus on lay investiture. How was the controversy actually resolved?
As I said, with a compromise, but not until after a couple of unsuccessful solutions. King Henry V presented himself as a friend to the Reformed papacy. That is, he did until the death of his father.
Where you stand depends on where you sit.
Now, sole and uncontested king of Germany, he refused to concede the right of investiture with ring and crozier, and Paschal II, Pope Paschal II, refused to relax the papal prohibition on it. In 1110, negotiations between the two failed, and Henry V set out for Rome at the head of an army, ostensibly to be crowned emperor.
Okay.
Pope Paschal II then hit upon a compromise which became public on the 12th of February, 1111, on the day that the coronation was to take place. Henry would abandon the right of investiture and would confirm church ownership of lands that were not held from the king, in return for the church returning to the king the regalia.
In other words, bishops would abandon all rights, jurisdiction, and properties they held from the king, and would live on the lands given to them freely by the pious and from tithes. They would abandon all political power and jurisdiction and become purely spiritual pastors. I can't imagine the bishops being happy with this deal.
And they weren't. The response from the gathered bishops and clergy was an immediate and violent hell no. The cardinals denounced it, and the German bishops refused to be bound by it.
I imagine that King Henry V also rejected it. He depended on bishops as his administrators and advisors. Paschal II sounds incredibly naive.
You know something? He was pious, but he was naive. And Henry V, for his part, refused to give up the practice of lay investiture. So they were at an impasse. Paschal refused to crown Henry, because Henry wouldn't give up lay investiture, and Henry did what German kings tended to do. He took the Pope captive.
Okay.
2 months later, the captive Pope agreed to what's called the privilege of memorial. In it, the Pope granted to King Henry the right of investiture before consecration, promised to anoint him emperor, and swore never to excommunicate him.
In other words, the emperor won, game, set, and match.
Thank you for the tennis reference.
Well, it is your passion, along with this podcast.
Yeah.
But I suppose that solution went over even worse with the bishops.
Again, the response was unanimous. It was a unanimous rejection. And there was even talk at this point of deposing Paschal. Paschal, freed from captivity, immediately quashed the privilege.
Okay, so we have two failed solutions. Okay, the third was the charm, but what was it?
That actually happened not in Germany, but in England, of all places.
Okay.
Archbishop and Saint Anselm and King Henry I were at loggerheads over the practice of lay investiture. The dispute was heated enough that Anselm chose to go into exile in 1103, the second time as Archbishop he went into exile, and he finally excommunicated King Henry I. In 1105, Henry I chose to seek reconciliation. It wasn't because of some come-to-Jesus moment. Henry was planning to invade Normandy, which was held by his older brother, Duke Robert, and he wanted the support of the church, and he didn't want to be excommunicated. In December of 1105, Anselm and Henry hammered out a compromise that was to be accepted by Pope Paschal II. Henry would accept the ban on lay investiture. Paschal would lift excommunication of bishops who had been so invested, and Henry would continue to receive homage from newly elected bishops in return for their landed fiefs and the temporal powers they received from him as king. The last reversed Urban II's decree of 1095 against bishops doing homage to laymen. The agreement was formally ratified by the king and archbishop in the so-called Concordat of London in 1107.
I love the way they could blow off decrees of previous popes. But it sounds like the English solution recognized the bishops' two bodies. As pastors of the church, bishops received their authority and power from God, from the church's clergy through apostolic succession. But as magnates of the realm and landholders of fiefs, they received their temporal powers and authorities from the king.
It is the bishops' two bodies, and that became the blueprint for resolving the controversy in the Holy Roman Empire, and that was done at a diet in Worms in 1122. Guido, Archbishop of Vienne, the son of Count William of Burgundy, and related to the German, French, and English royal families, had been consecrated pope in 1119, taking the name Calixtus II. By this time, the controversy over investiture had already been resolved through compromise, as we've seen in England and also in France. The Emperor Henry V, urged on by the German princes, and Pope Calixtus II agreed to a similar compromise to end the dispute in Germany and Italy. The result was the famous Concordat of Worms. On the 23rd of September in the year 1122, Pope Calixtus II and Emperor Henry V met at Worms in Germany. The Concordat of Worms took the form of two reciprocal documents that were simultaneously issued: a papal privilege granted by Pope Calixtus II to the Emperor Henry V and successors, and an edict issued by the Emperor Henry V. Under this agreement, the emperor renounced the right to invest newly elected bishops with the symbols of their spiritual offices, the ring and the crosier. He also guaranteed the free elections of bishops and promised to restore to German bishops all the royal lands and temporal powers that he had confiscated during the dispute. In return, Calixtus II acknowledged the emperor's right to invest the bishop-elect with the symbols of his temporal office. Perhaps more significantly, the Pope granted the emperor the privilege to be present at episcopal elections and to decide disputed elections, quote, in favor of the sounder party. In essence, the Concordat of Worms was the German version of the English solution. There were some differences. Rather than granting the king the right to take homage from newly elected bishops, Pope Calixtus II granted Emperor Henry V the right to invest bishops with their regalia, their temporal lands, and powers delegated to them by the king. By implication, an emperor could also withhold the regalia, which would be a de facto veto of the election. In practice, the concessions that allowed the emperor to confer regalia and to be present during and decide disputed episcopal elections meant that the emperor retained a dominant voice in the selection of German bishops.
Do you think Gregory VII was spinning in his grave?
He might have been. Certainly, this is not the Dictatus Papae.
No.
But in terms of the central issue of the investiture controversy, the question of lay investiture, the Reformed papacy had won. From this point on, kings throughout Christendom could no longer claim to have the authority from God to invest bishops with their spiritual offices. The clergy, in this sense, had won independence from the laity. One might even see in this the beginnings of the separation of church and state.
This seems like a good place to break. Let's take up next time with the consequences of the investiture controversy and the establishment of the Papal Monarchy.
Yes, finally we will. Thank you for listening, and bye for now.